Welcome to the Iconic Scholar Podcast. I'm your host, Andrea Kessler, co-founder of Scholarnetics 360. Get ready to journey beyond textbooks and learn from healthcare's brightest minds. Each episode is packed with insights and wisdom from industry leaders, uncovering the lessons and experiences that shape their careers. Join us to unlock the secrets to your successful career and discover the innovations shaping healthcare's future. Remember, while we're here to educate and inspire, we are not offering medical advice, just fun, educational, and authentic conversations. Okay, let's begin. Welcome to episode 4 of the Iconic Scholar. This is Andrea Kessler and Eder Garavito. I'm so excited, Eder, because we have two of our dear colleagues with us. We have Dr. Shannon Richardson, who is an assistant professor at the College of St. Mary. He is an amazing human being. He's done wonderful things. He's a father, a husband. He has won awards, Kaiser Permanente, residency. He has so much experience and amazing value that he can bring to this conversation today. He's a published author. He has done amazing research in the area of grading for equity, bringing that to PT education. I'm so excited to talk to him more today. We also have Kyra Gause, who was instrumental in the accreditation process at College of St. Mary, and she was an amazing mentor to me and my peers. You'll hear all of us talk about Kyra and how great she was helping to manage us, right? Kyra, you really kept us in line. She is medical education coordinator, correct?
Yes.
But you're still doing accreditation things. So you must love accreditation. But I know, and I know that you're doing amazing things there as well. But Kyra is also an amazing mother, wife, and soon to be grandmother. So congratulations.
Thank you.
I'm so excited to have you both here, and I know Eder is really excited. So Dr. Richardson, I just want to touch base with you. I want to learn about your growth as a physical therapist, but also talk to us a little bit about that process that you went through. I know it's not easy going from the clinic directly into the classroom and teaching. I had a hard time with that, but I'd love to hear your experience.
Yeah, I had a little bit of experience, and I'll speak to kind of the later portion of that, going from the clinic. I started off, I was a TA, and, I'm at my alma mater, started doing some adjunct teaching, and then I was a residency faculty at the outpatient hospital chain that I worked at here in Arizona. So I had a little bit of experience, but to make the full jump was a lot. And it's not something that you're really prepared for, because it's one thing to kind of teach here and there where you get plugged in, you teach, like you're hired, and you come in and you do that and you leave. But there's a whole world of academia. You're in a whole new context where you are part of an institution. There's meetings, you're part of a team. You're not just coming in and teaching class and walking away. You have all that interaction, all those pieces. And not to mention, you're learning kind of how to do all those things at the same time. I think I had as supportive of a team and onboarding process I think someone could have had in this context, based on from what I've heard from other people. And it was really difficult for me. You start off, and for people that are teaching, everyone said it's going to take you 3 years. And I am now 3 years in, and I can definitely say that the first 3 years were a bear. It was extremely challenging because you've never done this before. It's one thing to talk about this a little bit here and there, but it is all you all the time. And so for me, it was a lot of a process. And then I became a student at the same time. There was, I enrolled in a terminal degree program. And so I did that concurrently while doing that. And this was also during COVID. There was a lot of things it was not a great time to do all that stuff at the same time, but it worked out in the end. But it was certainly an uphill challenge for me at that point.
And Shannon, you and I sort of transitioned at the same time. I think I had 8 months before you or something of the like, because you were just finishing up. Something that's interesting, though, you just mentioned adjunct teaching, right? And how you started doing adjunct teaching. And I feel like that is a stepping stone for a lot of us that want to, quote unquote, get our feet wet and see if we like academia. I'll share my opinion after yours. I'm curious what your thoughts are in terms of support, mentorship, accessibility, and everything you can think of when you compare a role as an adjunct instructor versus what you just compared to a full-time, I'm here, this is my gig sort of job.
Yeah, adjunct is the closest thing I can liken it to. I think everybody's familiar with this in healthcare. Is it's kind of like PRN in a way. where you come in and you have this specific thing that you're supposed to do, and then you kind of leave. You don't necessarily have to go to the staff meetings. Your onboarding process maybe not as good. You don't necessarily feel as integrated into the team or what you're working as a part of, but you do still have some standards. So if you're someone that likes that disconnectedness and I just want to kind of be dropped in and drop back out, it's something that's convenient. But if you're looking for more, you can feel kind of disconnected and lonely. And, I'm just kind of out here listless, and you're kind of left to your own devices in terms of what you're teaching and what you're doing. There might not be a lot of guidance. So it kind of depends on your personality, I think, and what you're looking for. For me, it worked fairly well. I was pretty comfortable with it. It's at my alma mater, so I had a lot of familiarity. I knew some of the other TAs, so it worked fairly well. But I could certainly see other people where you're just kind of thrust into this. You don't have any direction. I need you to do these things. You just show up, and there's not a lot of guidance or structure. And so in that regard, I think that could be really, really challenging for some people, but it kind of depends.
Right. And it's challenging for some people. And to clarify, when you say some people, you mean for those teaching the adjunct courses, right?
Yeah.
But it really isn't so much about the disconnect, because you're completely right about those logistics. Considering being tossed into an adjunct role like you and I have been before, just to summarize what you just said, you're just sort of like let loose to teach, right? Without much guidance oftentimes, because you're not part of the entire group. Like, we got to consider, perhaps, do students suffer from not having the greatest instructors in learning experiences? Because just like you mentioned, and I agree with you, we look back at after like 3 years of academia, like, wow, I've grown a lot, where we had that mentorship, where we had that guidance. Whereas somebody gives you a curriculum, tells you that you're teaching this course, gives you the textbooks and all the exams, and they're like, go. We don't know what we're doing, but we have to sort of pretend like we know what we're doing.
I mean, that's a huge, I think that's a whole conversation in and of itself, that, you never get taught how to teach. You have to have a bachelor's degree to be a second grade teacher, to be a fifth grade teacher, to be a high school teacher. And there's a ton of pedagogy and science and information behind that. And in higher education, oh, you did this for practice, so you must be able to teach this to people, which I think is a tremendous fallacy. No more than just because you were a good athlete means that you can coach this thing, you were good at playing an instrument. I almost argue that it's the opposite, that it's a completely different skill set for those types of things. And if you're naturally good at it, it's a little bit more challenging for you to be able to teach and educate someone else on how to do that, versus someone that really struggled and had to work through that. I think will probably make a better educator and teacher. And so that was one of the reasons why. It wasn't just because it was required, but I really wanted to go into and learn some more about pedagogy and andragogy and teaching principles. And that was, getting a doctor of education. I really get exposed to and learned a lot about that, along with some of these continuing education courses. Because to your point, people are paying a lot of money, and do people really know what they're doing in teaching? So do students succeed because of teachers, or do they succeed in spite of the teachers that they have? And I think, especially in higher education, it might be, that sounds maybe kind of bold, but it's more the latter, where despite, this person's ineptitude, it's like, well, I'm a good teacher. All these students failed the test. They just must all be bad students, or they didn't learn the information. There's no self-reflection and looking at that, when you never looked at, did you actually ever learn how to teach this information to someone? Teaching is a huge skill that takes a ton of time to develop, just like being a clinician or learning an instrument or playing a sport or anything else. You just aren't dropped in and all of a sudden you're really good at this because you were able to be a clinician. They're related, but it is a completely different skill set. And being good at the other one does not mean that you're going to be good at the opposite side of that.
And Andrew, you're like a clin ed guru here. So, and he just mentioned, you're a clinician, you might not be a good educator. How does that translate to clinical education?
Oh, 100%. And I think Shannon and I have had conversations along this line as well in the past. I would like to also mention, you're talking about the challenge just moving into education and teaching full-time. Eder and Shannon, you entered into teaching your first full-time job, not only as your first full-time teaching job, it was also a program that was being developed, right? So you had accreditation, you had all that process. And then Kyra, she really was the glue that pulled it all together. But an former APTA president, gave Kyra like the greatest compliment ever. He said every PT program needs a Kyra because she was so influential in every aspect of the accreditation process. So Kyra, I guess I'd love to pass a question off to you along the same lines, because you've worked with all healthcare areas, right? But now you're in the medical education area. So what is that like? Is it different? I mean, from the perspective of faculty.
It is different. It is very different. I mean, I just got back from one of their conferences, and It's different and then it's not different. I think one of the things that I said after going through 2 accreditations this year, and going through PT accreditations, I thought it wasn't as hard as I thought it should be because we're dealing with medical doctors and medical programs. And I thought PT was a lot harder. It required a lot more information. This one, it was rigorous, but I was kind of surprised because, PT education, there are all these standards, standard A, standard 90, standard 100, that's what it felt like anyway. And this one was a little bit more different in that I could actually help plug in some of the information from previous years and help with that process. I guess, when you're talking about mentoring, though, the mind frame of mentoring, I think, is both the same. Mentoring for a PT educator, mentoring for a PT student, very similar to mentoring for a fellow, which is who I work with. I work with fellows. So that same mind frame in that they need mentors is very much on par. How do I say it? Because it is a doctor and is on that hierarchy status of the hospital, while they have mentors or they talk about mentors, I think there's a little bit more of that they're expected to push on their own sometimes. Does that make sense? At least that's my perception. It may not be true or not. I mean, I may be perceiving it incorrectly, but that's my perception, is that there is a push that they just kind of push through it on their own. So they go through residency and then they can go through fellowship. Now the residencies are younger. They're just out of med school kind of thing. And they have mentors. I hear that they have mentors assigned to them. I don't hear it so much with fellows. And the fellows next stage is going to be as a employed physician. So, but I don't hear mentorship as much with them as I do with the residency. So it's kind of interesting. The whole mentorship thing, I don't know if is it 2000 talk or not. I didn't grow up with hearing about, oh, let's have a mentor, let's have someone guide you through. I never even thought about it. So I think it's very interesting and it is much needed. Now when I think about it, I'm like, oh, wow, do I have a mentor? And I can't think of anybody.
So you can't think of anybody that you would put a mentor title to.
Exactly. I can't. And the things that I have done in my work, and maybe it was mentor type or maybe it wasn't. Like, for instance, I've done things in my work copying other people that I've seen how they've done it. Like I remember my sister talking once about how she did something at work and, how she was very professional about it, how she did this and she, made sure everybody had things in order. And she just told the line. She's like, I made sure that I had everything organized and everything in order. And me remembering that's how I decided to do it. I was like, oh, I like that. And then I decided to work along the same way. So that's how I would probably have taken my mentorship, and that how I saw other people do it, then I would turn around and try to do it that way. If I felt like it was a very positive and a very strong way to do it.
Well, I also think that mentorship matters because, I mean, Kyra, like you were a huge mentor to me, whether you know it or not. Just in professional interactions, you and I faced a lot of challenges together from a clinical education standpoint because we were partners in crime, so to speak. And oh, Kyra, I have this problem I'm dealing with. Can you help me out with it? And you've really mentored me through that process. So I think that there also has to be a level of trust.
Yes.
And a relationship in place. Shannon, how do you feel about mentorship with your students? What does that look like now versus 3 years ago when you first started? Do you feel more comfortable with that mentorship relationship and building it than before? Because I just speak from my experience because I had a hard time with what does mentorship look like at first? And then over years, I was able to formulate that for myself. I'm curious what that was like for you.
I think for me, and this kind of touches on what Kyra discussed, is having, going through a residency program, that the whole thing is structured through mentorship. So I had a lot of experience in that regard and kind of seeing I had several different mentors over the course of a year, and, in other contexts. So I kind of had some familiarity with the dynamic and the context of that. So I was pretty comfortable with that. That said, just everything going on with, becoming a new full-time educator, enrolling in a terminal degree program, all those things happening, I wasn't as comfortable, and I didn't have the bandwidth either at that point, I think, to really be comfortable and confident in being a mentor. Because one of the things I say, in education is you have to be comfortable with, when you first start off with, there's a lot of things that you don't know what you're doing. You're starting off at the bottom, if you want to call it a ladder, a new context. You go from being a clinician, I'm an expert, or I'm very experienced. You're very comfortable in your day-to-day job. Whereas now everything is new. And so you are very uncomfortable. And so your confidence level and just the way that you feel in your day-to-day operation is very, very shaky, if you will. And so that's not a place where I'm like, hey, you know what? I don't know what I'm doing. Let me take on some other people and try to tell you what to do and how to help in these different spaces. Whereas now, I don't know if this was just by coincidence. I literally had a student a few weeks ago that reached out to me and said, hey, I would like to have you mentor me and work with me and coach me on these types of things. Now, that could be coincidence, or I'm in a very different space now. It is night and day where I was at 3 years ago. And now I feel much more comfortable, and I have some more idea of the type of guidance to give. And I know what I'm doing. I'm very comfortable in this terrain, much more confident. And I'm not to the point where I was, being practicing for 10 or so years. But like I said before, I'm much, much more comfortable to a place where I think, like you said, there's no way in hell I'm going to try to, teach someone else what they're supposed to be doing here versus, okay, I feel confident enough that I could give you some guidance. I could help you a little bit here. And so I know enough to be dangerous. So certainly a couple of years goes a long way, but it was starting off in that new context. It was really just kind of shaky at first.
I'm curious about something. First, just to clarify, I know Shannon really well, and he is dangerous. I want your perspective on something that has been troubling me. That in our own sort of world, in with Scholar Index 360, we are trying our very best to define and redefine. And sorry to sound cliche, but you mentioned residency, and you had mentors in residency, right? Did the individuals in your residency who mentored you have the ability to say whether you were good, not good, whether you passed, failed, or anything of the like?
And I just want to clarify, you mean like kind of like in a power dynamic, or do you mean more like in a rubric, like objective sense, like giving you a grade, so to speak, like
The,
pass?
the latter, rubric, grade, not power dynamic.
Yeah, so certainly. Yeah, so that was the case. They were basically, the ability to they had to do that. Like it wasn't there was a very standardized process.
Understood. And not to devalue your mentorship experiences or the residency program that you went to, because it's all incredible. Do you feel that in those moments where you were being mentored in your residency program with these fantastic clinicians who mentored you, do you feel like you were 100% comfortable to go to them in your most vulnerable state, perhaps, and confide in them in things that you may not confide in others without the fear of repercussions? Meaning, if you say this, they might not think I'm good enough, they might fail me, sort of thing.
So it came down to different mentors. It's very different. Like you're dealing with you get to know someone pretty intimately, but you spend a lot of time together. But it was very different personalities. So for some people that was the case. For others, that wasn't so much the case. But for me, it wasn't so much the fact to do with it was because they had the ability to fail me. It just maybe I didn't feel as comfortable being vulnerable. It's just more the interpersonal dynamics and communication, where I had different levels of closeness with the different people that I worked in that regard. So that would be the difference for me there. Like some of them, I had no problem telling them like, "Hey, I'm just really not getting this." Other times, yeah, it was very much kind of arm's distance where I just kind of keep my head down, do what I'm supposed to do, and move forward from there.
And I agree. And there's a huge difference between like, I'm not really understanding this and like, I made a huge mistake, right? So there is that level of vulnerability that a mentee needs to have to be able to appropriately communicate. So just to summarize, I mean, what do you think about this? What is your belief in this? Do you think that genuine mentorship relationships can develop or should develop between and two individuals where the mentor has some sort of a stake in that individual's future, meaning I can give you a grade or not. I can fire you or keep you.
Well, isn't that a boss or a teacher? I guess when you talk about a mentor, I'm thinking a mentor is very not subjective, very, objective. So I guess I'd always think like I never think of any bosses that I've ever had as mentors. If that makes sense. A mentor to me will be somebody who's a little bit out, who doesn't have that relationship with me. And then if they're a teacher, which I've never even thought about it, but in education, teachers who mentor, I don't understand how that relationship can be either. Because you're right, there's that level of trust that you have with that person. But as a teacher, they still have a little power over you.
And I think that you touched on, and that's kind of what the original, I wanted to clarify the different points of the question is. I think that it can certainly develop. I think it's easier outside the power dynamic because I think the power dynamic, there's always this discrepancy between the two. And at the end of the day, you have this power over me. You have the ability to kind of say yes or no, pass me, fail me, what have you. And so that is going to be a barrier to someone becoming vulnerable and opening up to a person because I'm only going to put myself out there so far. I think that it can certainly develop in those contexts. I just think that makes it a little bit harder. So for me, my view of mentorship, in the residency program, while they could pass you, not pass you, I didn't feel that way so much, like the power dynamic. It was more kind of very much because it's different. And you said power. Okay, I'm a licensed physical therapist already. Versus when you're a student, I need to get this over this huge hurdle, being able to pass the board exam and become a licensed physical therapist. It's different stakes. So I figured, worst case, if this residency goes terrible, I am still licensed physical therapist. I still have a job. These types of things. That wasn't the case at all. So I think the context to Kyra's point really does matter. Like it can certainly exist within a power structure of a teacher and a student, or a boss and a subordinate or employee. But I think that it does make it a little bit more challenging when there's kind of stakes involved, where one of the you're not because you're not going to necessarily be equals in terms of position, but when you are directly reporting to somebody, or they have the ability to kind of change some outcomes or tangible things for you, that certainly does make it more challenging.
And I feel like if you're in that relationship of like your boss or your teacher, they're not, to me, they're not mentoring, they're just guiding, which is a bit different. They're guiding me to a certain place that is beneficial for me to be in. Not necessarily beneficial for me, but beneficial for them.
I think in a way, Kyra, you could another way. This is kind of a less positive way to look at this is they're doing their job. Like
Yeah.
I'm supposed to be. I'm a teacher. I'm supposed to be teaching you these things. I should be helping you develop and grow. I'm your boss. I should be making you do a better job with these types of things and coaching you along. So I think that it really gets into blurring some of these lines and what it means to be a supervisor, a boss, a teacher. I think that, to your point, a good boss, a good teacher, a good supervisor has some mentor-ish type tendencies, and they should be doing something, giving you some guidance and helping you grow as an individual, which to me ultimately is what mentorship is about.
Yes. And I will give you an example that I heard just this weekend at a conference. I was talking to a lady and she was talking about somebody who was her mentor. And it was a person who was higher up than her and kind of her boss and things. And the relationship they had was great. But when she told her mentor, her boss, I am going to start looking maybe at some other opportunities, she said, it's about time, you know? So here, her boss was like encouraging her that, yes, you are ready to go. You've outgrown, you're great at what you do. We don't want to leave you, but you are ready to move on. And to me, that's a boss mentor. That's a boss mentor because even though she's going to lose that person, she's okay in encouraging her to move on for her own benefit.
That's to me that's the crux of what mentorship is. Like the whole point of a mentor mentee, if it goes well, the person should hopefully outgrow you or get to the point where you don't need the mentor anymore, and then maybe you can become a mentor. That's to me the whole thing. It's kind of this dynamic relationship where you start to pay it forward, where it kind of goes on from there. If you're kind of holding the person under your thumb, and the end result is not them growing and maybe not becoming better than you or whatever you want to call it, or becoming a teacher themselves, then I don't really think that it's that valuable of a relationship if you're not growing and getting to the point that maybe you could mentor or you could outgrow that dynamic or that relationship.
Do you think, Shannon, that during residency, if you would have been more vulnerable in yourself with your mentors, that you perhaps would have had a I don't want to say more positive or better experience because I know you had a good one, but you could have learned more or could have learned quicker.
No, I don't. I don't think that the way that was set up, I don't think that that was a barrier. Like for me, like at least in that context, like I could certainly see that being the case, but in the context there, like I don't think that that was a reason for. If anything, it being reflective, I could have learned more just because it was me not being up to the moment and being up to the challenge. Like one of the best pieces of advice is that it was very blunt. One of the persons he said to me, he's like, "I know that you're better than this. You're capable of much better than this," and I didn't have a rebuttal for it. Like, you're right. And it was kind of, it had a couple of wake up calls or some moments where like, you need to really bring it. And what they said is you don't want to look back on this and wish that you would have tried harder or done more or put more time in. And so for me, that was anything that I think was left on the table was much more on my end. Like I hear what you're saying about that, but that wasn't a limitation for me, I don't think.
What if I was your teacher and I assigned you grades, A, B, C, D, E, what have you, and I told you, I made the same statement to you because you didn't perform well on a written exam. You can do better than this. Would that be perceived the same?
No, because the power dynamics are tremendously different. I don't think that you can have a much higher discrepancy in power dynamics than a teacher and a student, especially in higher education.
Right. So then how can we unblur those lines that you said were blurred in terms of those dynamics of educators mentoring students?
I don't. The thing is, I think that the person that has the more power has to be extremely cognizant of that at all times. At all times, the student is going to see you as a teacher, and I think if that line ever gets blurred, I think you also have to maintain that to an extent. I'm not saying that you need to say that I'm higher above you. You need to maintain a certain distance because you have to ultimately. If you get too close to the person, I think it kind of blurs your ability to give the person objective advice and feedback and guidance. And so that's why I think it's a delicate balance. And then, I mean, there's a lot of different concepts to go into that, like really acknowledging that power. And then how do you communicate being, culturally responsible and aware of kind of the different dynamics and how that's going to play. You get into identity, gender, race, all these different types of things. All that stuff is going to play a role in how that dynamic plays out and how you communicate, how you present and show up in talking to that person. So I mean, I know that's not directly the question that you asked, but I think there was a lot that goes into just that one-to-one interaction. But at the very forefront of that is the fact that you are the teacher. You have the ability to literally pass or fail this person in a super high stakes, super expensive context where you can literally ruin someone's life. Like you have the ability, if they fail one class, they might fail out of the program. And that is tens of thousands of dollars and years down the drain in their life. And so I think that you have to start with acknowledging and understanding that that is the power that you have over that person. Even if you're not wielding it, so to speak, you need to really be cognizant of that in those communications.
So, Shannon, top 3 tips for an educator thinking about things they have to keep in check or ways that they can maybe formulate in their heads. Are they maybe yielding power a little bit, in a negative space for students? What are top 3 areas that you think all educators need to really look at and be honest with themselves to say, yeah, I'm making this a safe space for my students?
I think that very first thing is just really acknowledging and being aware of that. Like, when you are writing to this person, this is the voice, this perspective, this is coming on. Like you could literally say like a high low. I think a lot of students, that is the starting point where you're viewing that from. Like you have to realize that's the starting point when you're talking to this person. And then I think really looking at how you present, how your identity, what your kind of this person might perceive you, your dynamic with students in general, and then also looking at that individual. I'm not going to send the same email to every single student. I'm going to take into account our relationship, the way that I communicate, my style, my presentation, my identity, and try to look at those things with that individual. Like that's what, if you want to talk about the concept of equity, you should not be talking and communicating with everybody in the same type of fashion. And so I think if you're doing that, and that this isn't even just when teacher and student, this is just in your interpersonal life. To me, this is good communication. You're trying to kind of, mold and kind of change things, the whole know your audience. I think that will go a long, long way if you're aware of those power dynamics and you kind of look at those differences in identity and you're really trying to communicate in terms and meet the person where they are and meeting them halfway. I think that goes a long, long way for starting to develop some trust, and also kind of keeping an appropriate distance or dynamic because that relationship needs to be maintained. But I don't think that it needs to be this whole I'm here and you're there. It needs to be pointed out like this whole iron fist thing. It should almost be like I'm guiding and walking side by side to Kyra's point. I think that you can almost get more to a mentorship type relationship or some mentor tendencies, but that power dynamic is always, always going to exist no matter what you do. And I think if it's gone to an extent, then maybe you have gone too far into, I think, kind of those waters of developing that personal relationship because at the end of the day, you do have that role to fulfill as a teacher and they're there to be a learner or student.
Exactly, right? And so I couldn't have thought of a better answer, to be honest. And I'm being completely honest with that. But I'm just going to go ahead and say it because of all of those dynamics that you mentioned, and because faculty members do have so many other responsibilities. And our main responsibility is to educate our students who are potentially going to treat us and our family or our family members, right? I just don't believe that true, genuine mentorship relationships can develop between individuals in those capacities. Can a mentorship relationship be developed? Sure. Can it be maintained without ever, with those blurred lines and all trying to, as a faculty member, really navigate all those waters. I just don't think so. And so that's why, as Kyle was speaking earlier, we really need to seek mentorship outside of those power dynamics and make it available, of course. But also, I think part of what we need to start doing as a healthcare profession is defining mentorship. What is mentorship? We throw that word out like candy, right? And so we need to start really putting a definition to that. And that's what we're starting to do now. And we're starting to really make people aware of it. And you're really helping us with that. We need to start defining, if I post something on Instagram that I'm mentoring somebody, like, what does that mean? Instead of just saying I mentor someone, perhaps I taught them something. Perhaps I showed them something. As Kara mentioned, perhaps I guided them. So I think we just need to further define what mentorship really is in our profession.
I think you're correct, because I think from what I've seen, there's been this blur between coach and mentor. I mean, coach, you're trying to get them to the finish line. I'm going to cheer you on. I'm going to help you. I'm going to give you the things you need to get down there to the end zone. That's a coach. But a mentor is just so much. I think a mentor is so much more than that, because the mentor is going to walk off with you off the field and into life. You know, a mentor is going to kind of be that person that's going to show you how to do the balance of life and work and how to get to the life end goal. But a coach is trying to just help you win the game. And I think to me, that's the blurry line.
I think you bring up a great point. So you talk to new grads. I was a new grad at some point. We all were at some point, and you hear, "Oh, I want to go to a place, like I want to still learn." That's one of the reasons I did residency. Oh, this place offers mentorship. Well, what does that mean? And so there's places where, to me, this needs to be, to Edgar's point, this needs to be defined. So there's certain places where, like, okay, you have this person that's designated to you that you're going to meet with them once a week, and you're going to go, like, that's okay. There's some structure. And to me, going back to the point before, the context and the structure matters a lot. Versus some of these things, we offer mentorship where this person that's more experienced than you is available to be able to talk to you about stuff from time to time. And that is technically, you could say under that ambiguous term, that's mentorship. But when it's not structured, it's not intentional, that person's not going to be there at all times and not available for you. That's not that person's fault, but that's not an actual example of true mentorship. Like a true mentor, like you said, should be a long personal relationship that is individual to you and that person. In my experience, the mentors I've had, you get to know each other quite well. You may or may not become friends, but you know each other very well, and you have to develop that, because you're interacting with that person and giving them advice that is specific to them and their situation in a way that's meaningful to them and it's going to impact them, just like you wouldn't be the same mentor to another student, to another new grad. And that is a much, to Kyra's point, deeper relationship. And I think that if you're looking for that, there needs to be some parameters, some context for that to be able to be successful versus, to Edward's point, just tossing it. Oh, yeah, sure, I'll mentor you.
Absolutely. And I mean, obviously, it's very apparent you had awesome mentorship relationships and mentors. But you just brought up something else that I want to address. When you said, when you go to residency or you get a new job and new grads seeking jobs with mentorship and you get a mentorship assigned. Now we're talking about forced mentorship. What if like that mentor doesn't want to mentor that individual because they have too big of a caseload? So how does that dynamic work if it's a forced assignment of mentorship?
Well, even in education, I know I've been assigned mentors who wanted nothing to do with mentorship. And that was not easy in my transition from clinic to classroom. So I think it happens in every area. I think we have to talk about inequity. Like Shannon, I have to say it. We have grading for equity. It is something that you've put a lot of time into training, but you've done a lot of research in that area. And I really want to touch on that. But do you think we have inequity in mentorship because of the structure, potentially? Do we need to talk about mentoring for equity?
Yeah, and I think that it's all these things come from those interpersonal dynamics. I think that, to both of your point, the starting point for being a mentor, you should want to do it. Both people should want to be in the relationship. Otherwise, it is not going to go well. And as you're someone that has a ton of clinical education experience, clinical instructors, I think, are kind of ground zero for this. It is not likely going to be a good experience if you are forced basically to take on a student and the student is forced to be with you. Nobody wants to be in a situation where they're forced to do something that they don't want to do. So you talk about inequity, even if it's a great fit between the two people, the fact that they don't want to participate in that dynamic is a huge issue aside from all those other personal interpersonal dynamics with identity and the ability to mentor and teach and educate and coach someone. So to answer your question, yes, there's tremendous inequity, but I think that we can't miss out on that parallel that clinical education, CIs and students is the same thing. Same thing, just a different twist on that same kind of theme that we're talking about here.
You need to come back and have another conversation with us for sure on clinical education. And Kyra can fill us in on a few things too, I'm sure. But to jump back to the grading for equity piece, I guess I'd like to ask the two of you, like, now that you've had some time in this space and developing, and Kyra, from your experience, even on the medical education side, where do you see areas for us to really improve in education to close that gap, if we can, in the inequity in healthcare? That's kind of a loaded question, but
Yeah, that's really loaded. You cannot get, and I hate to start off with a cannot negative, but you're not going to get there if you don't have the practice to bring in students that are of different races. And if you're not honing in on that practice, you're not going to get there. And then because you already got some biases going on anyway, I mean, it's just there. Is the elephant in the room. There are just implicit biases going on all over the place. And it's going on in education and it's going on in the medical field. And if there's not a strenuous act to try to make sure that you have some diversity, that you have some different doctors of different ethnicities and of different cultures and of different, all in your field. I don't know. How do you grade for equity when you're always used to seeing what you see, that everybody that looks like you? You immediately, to me, have an implicit bias because you're not used to seeing that anybody else like you. And you also have in your background in your head what you think somebody who doesn't look like you should be, act like, or is.
You hit on a ton of things. I mean, this brings back to mind the quote. I think this was 2 years ago when the editor of the Journal of JAMA basically said that physicians are not racist. They can't be racist. And this isn't just race. There's a ton of different identities. There's sexual identity. There's race, ethnicity, all these different parts of identity. So when these things don't exist in these spaces, there's going to be blind spots, and it doesn't have to mean that it's necessarily some malice. You don't know what you don't know and what you haven't been exposed to, what you haven't interacted with. And when you're in spaces where you don't have to interact with that, you're not going to know how to interact with that. But you know what does exist? When you're treating patients and interacting with individuals, there are people with different identities. There's gay people, there's Black people, there's people that don't speak English as a first language. There's people that have different abilities, they have differences. All of those different people you're going to come and interact with, and you need to be taught how to interact with them and dignify them and treat them with humility. And I think to your point, it's not just having students, you need to have people that are educating the students in those spaces to be able to do those things. And those people that are educating the students also probably need to be educated by people that are aware of those different dynamics and able to teach those things. And I think that the whole equitable grading is a small piece that is a play off of all of that greater things. Because if you're going to talk about this, you have to look at, you say the elephant in the room, the systemic and structural discrepancies and disparities that exist in terms of historically marginalized and minoritized people. This stuff exists on a structural level. That's why race is a risk factor, not because of genes, because of the way that you are treated differently in the medical system. Because of your identity, because of your race, your sexuality, you have worse outcomes, not because of your genes, but because you are objectively going to get worse care. Your outcomes are worse. And I think that that's something that not a lot of people acknowledge and look at. Like, no, race is a risk factor. It is not genetic. That is because when you go to these places, you're going to be discounted. Your pain is going to be looked at differently. You're not going to be asked as in-depth of questions. You're going to be disregarded because of your gender, the way that you look, the way that you're taught, all these different types of things. And that is a huge, huge, huge problem. I know that we're kind of getting off from grading for equity, looking at social determinants and these other factors, but all of this stuff is connected together. And equitable grading in that process is, I think, just one small piece of that.
Yeah, and I have to say, Shannon, the way you articulate all of that information that you just provided us, like, we need to hear more of it. How can we connect with other people? I mean, it has to be an everyday practice, but how can we connect with other educators? What are you doing? I know you've written some papers, you've I think you've had some presentations through APTA. Tell us about what you're doing to get the connection with other educators to move in this direction. I think it's a true movement, and I think you need to take it and run.
Well, I think that it's so for me, like, so I have some experience with, being a sort of like with racial, identity, but, sexual and gender minority. I'm taking a sexual gender minority education training class. Like this course is, it's several months long. Like we're on the last month of this. I think it's 5 or 6 months total. We're meeting and it's basically getting into these spaces and interacting with people that are different than you and really kind of finding out. It's not just reading about these things, it's learning. Like you have to get out of your comfort zone. Like nobody knows about all these different types of dynamics and identities. And like you have to really learn about this type of stuff. And that takes reading, that takes talking to people, having conversations. And it's not this kind of tokenism like, oh, I know one person that is this. It is very different when you have regular conversations and relationships with people that have these different identities. And so there's training courses, there's spaces, there's events locally that you can go to. There's message groups. I mean, with the internet now, with connectivity with things like Zoom, there's lots of opportunities to be able to interact and talk to people that have different identities and see these centers and people that are doing this work in local communities and on the national level to really get a chance to see and educate yourselves like, wow, there's another side, or there's, talk about this, the dominant identity. Not everybody is a white cisgender Christian male. Like there's a ton of different people that are outside of that identity. And unfortunately, you can kind of be relegated to other when you don't have that identity, but you spend time in those spaces and interact with those people, you can see all the different commonalities and see that there's a lot of the same issues and problems from being disenfranchised. So to me, it's just putting yourself out there. It's not hard. I mean, to go online, you can Google and search if you want to learn about this stuff isn't new. Like gay people just didn't come out. Black people just weren't invented. People that don't speak English, like these problems, people have written about and talked about this for years. And so it's very easy to me to go out and just find the damn information and look at this stuff. And I think to try to find these spaces and, forgive me for using stronger language in this, but these people have been talking about these problems and these issues for literally hundreds of years. And so I don't think this is something like, oh, all of a sudden 2020 happened or 2021 and all these things didn't change. You are literally just some people becoming aware of something that's been around for a very long time. And so I think it just comes down to listening and really being open to the fact that there are different perspectives outside of yours. And there's a decent chance that you may have only viewed the world through a certain lens and that you don't see, just because you don't see something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I think that's kind of the crux of it. It's like, I've never seen that happen, so it must not exist. Well, that's because of your identity, the spaces that you occupy and what you, and when you get into those different spaces and interact with different people, you start to see some different things. You get to see some different lenses, some different experiences, and you get to see sometimes how other people might feel a certain type of way about things.
Eder, I feel like you have a question.
I have a lot of questions. First, Shannon, you just dropped a bomb on us, an amazing bomb, and in a way that like I think and I hope the vast majority of listeners can understand, because a lot of these topics and concepts I think are not understood by people because they're not very well explained, and we need more Shannons, and I value everything you say, and I mean that genuinely because it is a very powerful message, especially when you say this has been around forever. Yeah, like I mean, race has been around forever, healthcare has been around forever. Why are we talking about it now? But we are talking about it now. We can't change the past. So since we're talking about it now, I mean, do you have any recommendations beyond what you just mentioned, reading and reaching out to people? Let's just be specific. Any recommendations for clinicians who are perhaps new grads or just transitioning into a clinical role so that they can be more sensitive to this information and these different, ethnicities and identities that they see on a daily basis?
And I'd like to just extend that question to say also that do you have any resources for a clinician who might be experiencing microaggressions?
Yeah,
and those
absolutely.
experiences
Absolutely.
in the clinic as a clinician?
I think one of the things you said, Shannon, was that I honed in on was step outside of your comfort zone. I don't know if that's taught in education or not, but that was one of the things Shannon said when he was talking about going online and finding out things.
So I think that the growth comes from stepping out of your comfort zone. Like the mentorship dynamic you talked about, it's going to be, if it's a good relationship, it should be uncomfortable at times.
But what about like people that work in specific areas that they don't have that population?
No, of course. So for example, a specific tangible example. So the way that I found the class that I'm in right now, there is literally a LGBTQIA plus handbook for physical therapists that's written that you can find. There's different groups, there's alliances that it literally has examples of different terminology. There's literally patient scenarios. This is something that I've kind of started to integrate into some of the classes that I teach. So this is a tangible example of things like, all right, so what does cisgender mean? Like, what does this term mean? There's literally patient scenarios like someone dead names someone, or someone uses the wrong pronouns for someone, or like, what are some tips that you could do? Here's some example intake forms. Really looking at those types of things. Those are small changes that it's challenging for you to try to change the way that your facility, your clinic practices. I completely get that. You're a new grad. You want to talk about power dynamics. I'm just trying to get my check, start paying off my loans, which could be another conversation. I'm not here to rock the boat. I just want to get in here and get my job. And so I'm not going to come in here day one. You need to do this, 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 and then this. That takes a special type of person. But can you change the way that you interact and talk to people? And that's where that handbook is one example like that. You talk about Twitter, X, Instagram. There's a lot of junk and garbage information, but there's a lot of people that post their experiences and share these types of, maybe this is something that, I could give you, I don't know all of them off the top of my head, but like the list of these things, you could link to these resources to see. That's where I get it. Like you could see a lot of conversations that are happening in this digital space, but you have to look and follow queer people, people that are Black, people that don't speak English as a first language, and you get into these different spaces and you can really get some exposure that way. So I think that's one way to kind of do it, where that's something that you can do right now. It doesn't cost you anything. It's a little bit of time where you can go and implement this the next day in your clinic, at your hospital. You're going to a patient's home for doing home health or whatever that is.
Yeah, we're definitely going to pick your brain for some of these resources and place them in the show notes and link them because I think they're invaluable. And I'll be, one of the first to admit here that I probably don't know all of these resources and would have never known where to look. So this is a great start even for me and for anybody who's listening.
Kyra, I just want to say one thing. I don't know, Eder and Shannon, if you know how many students lean on Kyra. They saw her as support and a confidant going through some challenges. And, students, undergrad, graduate, whatever, right? But Kyra, what are some of the suggestions you have for maybe a student listener who's struggling? You can probably share some of the common struggles that you heard from students.
Especially if you're in an undergrad or if you're a grad student, sometimes I think a lot of times the struggle is connecting either with your courses, connecting with your professor, not having that relationship with your professor that you want to have and stuff like that. And I think the one thing I would share is that if you cannot connect with your professor, there is always a staff member that you may be able to reach out to. And I don't say limit yourself to a person who's just staff. There's a janitor. There is the person in the kitchen. All those people are literally probably rooting for you to get through, and you can connect. And I think when we were at CSM, I know that some of the students talked with janitors. It was a small enough environment, but I know some of those students would talk with janitors. There was a lady who worked in the kitchen that the students absolutely loved and would go and talk to her about, issues that they had on campus. So it's not, if you cannot connect with your professor, if you feel like there's no one else in that hierarchy that you can connect with, just go down lower, and, go to the staff, not that we're lower, but go to staff, keep going, because I think there's always somebody in there at that campus that you will be able to go to for advice and just to get a connection. And then that helps you connect with the school.
And I don't think you should devalue yourself or anybody by saying higher or lower. I know there's a hierarchy, but to your point, I think that's brilliant, Kyra. One of the best pieces of advice that I received from what I considered a mentor outside of an educational landscape was that when I start my career as a clinician, to always ensure that I speak to everybody. It doesn't matter if they're the owners of the hospitals or what have you, or if they're just there to clean rooms. I mean, you make relationships with everybody, and not only can you make somebody's day, you will learn something, and you will learn about their position, their job, the intricacies of what they're doing, and you also learn how they're tied into, in my situation, this example, how they are tied to patient progress. sure, a surgeon fixes something and sure, we help fix other things and blah, blah, blah. But like, there are other individuals that do not lay hands on patients that play a giant role in their progress and their rehabilitation that we do not give enough credit to. So I love that you were able to see that from those students. And that's an incredible piece of advice.
One of the things that when you said that, Power, that really made me think about the term is the concept of belonging. And I think that's what a lot of students are really looking for and seeking, especially if you have one of these marginalized or minoritized identities, that you may not be able to find that necessarily from your classmates or from your advisors. And Andrea, to whomever's point it was before about these forced relationships, you don't get to pick who your advisor is either. There's a lot of times where, you know what, I'm not feeling my advisor. Like we just don't jive. The person is nice enough or whatever. And a lot of times you will end up becoming sometimes a de facto advisor for some of these other students because they feel more comfortable talking to you. And you may end up being advising someone, like you said, that's outside of the faculty, that's a staff member, that's someone from another program, because you connect with that person, because people are seeking that belongingness, that safety, that trust, that like all humans want that on a basic level. And not everybody is able to find those spaces. You know, when you talk about predominantly white institutions or depending on your dynamics and your identity, it can be really hard for you to find that space. And that's on top of, you talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that safety, that belongingness. Forget about learning stuff. If you're not able to have those basic needs of safety and comfort met, it's going to become increasingly challenging for you to access and get into those other things where I feel comfortable enough to be able to show up in class or raise my hand, let alone feeling vulnerable on space and on camp. Because, as it turns out, grad school is pretty challenging enough. Even if you have all of the resources, support, belonging, and everything, when you take some of those things away, it becomes even more of an uphill battle for some people.
It really does. I think I'm so grateful to the both of you for joining us to talk about, we covered a lot, Eder.
We covered, I think, more than we had on our notes.
Holy cow. But I think we could talk another hour, and I hope you both can come back and continue the conversation. We have so much more to even talk about. So I'm excited for you two. Will you both come back? I hope.
Oh yeah, sure.
Certainly.
Yeah, this was honestly one of my favorite recordings that I've been a part of and that we've recorded so far. Gosh, we can talk forever. And yes, let's do it again. Yeah, thank you all for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for joining us on the Iconic Scholar podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode and want to continue the conversation, don't forget to connect with us on social media as @ScholarNetics360. Make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. And remember, always consult with a healthcare professional for medical advice. Until next time,